Hello, everybody, and welcome to our May 2018 webinar. My name is Adam Smith, and I am the Business Development Manager here at Discoverygarden. And with me, I have everyone's favorite Islandora expert, Dan Aiken.
Hello.
Today's webinar is going to feature a Islandora Q&A session. I asked participants to send your questions in beforehand. We have received about 7 or 8, I believe, which we will go over today. So there's some great questions in there. I learned some things going over the answers as well, and I'm sure that you will you'll take a lot of information away from this webinar. At the end of the session, we're going to open the floor to any additional questions. So don't be scared to type them in the chat window, and we'll get to them after we read the sessions or the questions that were submitted earlier. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with the submitted questions, and then we're going to open the floor to everyone else. And with that, I'll read out the first question and pass things over to Dan. So question number 1, is it possible to correct records in a batch? Say the same information should be on 10 records, but I only have it on 1. How does Islandora support METS objects?
Okay. So 2 things here, sort of. One being the batch correcting of records and the other being the support of METS. So batch correcting of records, there's a couple of ways to accomplish this, but the most commonly supported one that we recommend is the xQuery module, just because it's very full-featured and allows you to do fairly granular things like this. The xQuery module works by providing you a way to take a set of search results that you filter down, using search terms and advanced search and facets and things like that, and allowing you to perform xQuery operations on them, which allows you to take the XML metadata for each record, make changes to it in bulk, and then reapply it to the original objects. The xQuery module is also nice in that it tells you exactly what modifications that it's about to make before you actually make them. So you can see whether or not the changes that you're trying to make through xQuery are actually going to be correctly applied to whatever you're doing. That, I guess, is the biggest way that we recommend. There's another couple of ways it can be done. There's a new module that I haven't really taken a look at that does data stream CRUD, which may be able to perform bulk updates like this. I'd have to look into it, I guess. And then the other simplest way is to just download all the records, make the changes manually, and then re-upload them. But obviously that's not precisely very batchy, so it's a less recommended solution to the problem. xQuery is probably the best bet. As for Islandora supporting METS objects, it doesn't really support them in a METS context. As well, some cursory digging that I did suggested that METS metadata isn't highly supported either by Islandora itself or by anything provided by the community. We do have a METS rights form that's available for use. It's sitting on the Islandora Labs repository. There's a form that can be used to enter that kind of metadata into objects, but it doesn't support the full METS spec. Now, that being said, any type of XML can be supported inside Islandora in 2 steps. One is to create a form that supports that type of XML. And then 2 is to create a transform of some kind that will take your brand new fancy XML and move it into Solar. Now that's 2 steps, which isn't that many steps. However, each of those steps is a fairly complicated thing that requires a little bit of know-how and a little bit of, I don't know, gumption, but it's not completely out of the question. We've done it in the past for all kinds of different metadata formats. So, out of the box, it used to just support mods and Dublin Core. But then that was expanded to provide support for all kinds of other metadata, like qualified Dublin Core and Mark XML and other things like that. So that honestly could be done for any type of metadata. It's just that nobody's done it for METS yet. But You could potentially be the first just by making a form and making a transform to get those things into Solr. Sounds easy, but it's a little bit of a complicated task, but absolutely possible for that support to exist.
All right, thank you, Dan. On to question number 2, and this one's a bit long-winded, so bear with me while I read through it. First, a little background. I inherited an Islandora site. The previous sysadmin got the code for the various Islandora modules by cloning their respective GitHub repos. Then he copied the code of the various modules without the Git directory in the proper Drupal path for those modules libraries. I suspect he took this approach since we source control the files of our Islandora Drupal instance through Git. Therefore, I suspect the previous sysadmin did not want to store the individual's modules Git files inside of our main Drupal instance Git repo. My question is this a common approach when running Islandora modules from their individual repos, or should we try a different approach? One of my concerns is that I have module code in 2 places: the local individual Islandora module code repos, and then the version without Git directory inside our Drupal instance. One issue is that it is tricky to verify what commit was checked out when the module code was copied over to the Drupal instance.
This one was kind of a surprising one, actually. I have not heard of this approach, and I guess, to be frank, I don't think it falls under best practice. The typical way that Islandora is deployed to different sites is by specifying commit hashes for each Git repository for each module that you're going to clone down, and have sort of a unified method of specifying exactly what commit hashes you want for each module that can sort of deploy it automatically. We do that through Puppet, but I mean, there's all sorts of ways to do that. Ansible is another popular one where you could have something as simple as a shell script that just contains a bunch of commit hashes that can go through. Yeah, I would say that your concerns with the way that this is set up are absolutely valid. I would recommend one of 2 things, I guess, to move this over to. The sort of best possible practice one is to have all of your modules as actual Git repositories with specifically checked out commit hashes. So you can say specifically, I'm on this commit here for this module, and you can look at that and you can say, this is where I am. And then you would be able to do a sort of a more traditional backup of your site rather than having it in a Git repo, put it, tarball it up and put it in Amazon S3 or something like that. That would be one way of doing it. Or you could sort of do it similar to the current setup where you have all of the Drupal modules set up as submodules of one central Git repo. That would provide you with the same sort of functionality where you get to specify specific commit hashes, and you don't have to have Git repos within Git repos. You just have submodules inside a Git repo that you can then, when you're deploying, you say, okay, pull down my Drupal repository and then recurse through and deploy all the submodules, and then you get all your, and then it goes through and says, okay, well, I'm going to deploy this submodule at this specific hash. So you still get that very specific version control without having to maintain a bunch of folders that are missing their .git folder, which seems kind of spooky to me, I guess. Yeah, I could not, unfortunately, tell you how you're going to be able to determine what commit hash is correct for each of your repositories. Currently, I don't think there's really going to be any way to do that. You might just have to go by last modified dates inside the folders or something like that. That's a tricky one. But I mean, once you've got that information, I would say easiest way is to take your existing repository and switch everything over to Git submodules. But then the best practice way is to have an automated deployment system that just has a list of correct commit hashes for each of the repositories and can just go and send that out, whether that be through a shell script or whether that be through Puppet or Ansible or some other system like that.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Moving on to question number 3. Does Islandora support batch commands and global updates?
So the answer to this question, I guess, is maybe. It depends on what you're trying to do. For the most part, we've tried to ensure that there are batches in place for every single thing that you could possibly think of doing or want to do or have in your entire setup. But I'm sure we've missed some edge cases that people think about that are just like, why didn't you implement this? It's so obvious or simple. The most obvious ones that are implemented currently are batch ingest commands that allow you to take either zip files or folders full of files and automatically ingest them into a repository. There are a bunch of other batches for doing other sorts of tasks inside Islandora, like the one I had mentioned before with Xquery, so that you can automatically update a whole bunch of different modules at the same, or a whole bunch of different records at the same time. There is support for batch deletion of records. You can do that through the interface, or I believe there might be a command line version of that as well. Those are the primary ones for ingesting, modifying, and deleting records. Whatever other batches you're trying to do, again, the answer is going to be a maybe. It depends on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. As for global updates, I think that might be referring specifically to being able to globally update records that are already in your repository. If that's the case, then absolutely it supports that. If that's referring to another kind of update, like updating to a new version of different modules or something like that, yes, it supports that. It's like if you're doing things through the method that we had mentioned previously, then absolutely you can just update to a newer commit hash. You can update to a newer version of each module, and as long as you've made sure that they're all relatively in step with each other, then the standard update process through Drupal should be just fine to get those in place.
Question number 4. How does Islandora handle the translation of audio and video to various delivery formats such as MP3, QuickTime, Windows Media, etc.?
So for both of the audio and video content types, the original copy of the file that you upload, whether it be an MP3 file or a QuickTime file or Windows Media, audio, AVI, Wave, whatever you uploaded is going to stay there as you uploaded it in its original format. However, we do extract display formats for each of those content types. The display form, I mean, I say display, it's a, you're not really displaying an audio file, but you're providing a method of playback for an audio file. And the playback version of the audio file is an MP3 that is generated with the LAME audio encoder. And for video, it's transcoded into MP4 that is done with the FFmpeg video encoder. There's a couple of different little settings that you can do for each of those in each of their respective modules that provide each of those content types, but that's the primary method. So a playback MP3 is created by LAME when you upload audio objects, and a playback MP4 is created for video when you upload a video object. There's another couple of types that are supported for each of those, but they are optional. You can put those in there if you'd like. but there are options to turn those other formats off and just fall back to the standard derived MP4 version or MP3 version of it. And then for the rest of it, like for the QuickTime, Windows Media, whatever was the original that you uploaded, we really just store that inside Fedora, and it stays there and it never really gets touched. It's really just the display version of it that you see day to day, and then if you need to get back your original QuickTime or Windows Media or whatever, then that's fine. It's just sitting there ready for you to re-download.
All right, moving right along, question number 5. Please discuss role management and how different users can have different roles and permissions.
So there's pretty granular permissions established by all of the different Islandora modules. Most of them are established by Islandora itself to give users sort of granular permissions for whatever they might want to do in the repository. And then a couple of the other modules specify their own permissions for doing this or that. So the primary way that Drupal manages this is by allowing you to establish roles and then giving those roles to users. Users themselves never actually have any permissions. Users are only given roles, and those roles define what permissions they have. A user can have multiple roles, so if you have role A, which defines some permissions, and role B, which defines some other permissions, and you give a user roles A and B, they will have a combination of both of those sets of permissions. So for Islandora itself, we break down the series of permissions you can give to a role to the most basic one being the ability to view things, and that goes for everything like viewing objects, viewing metadata, viewing images, viewing whatever part of the Islandora object you can think of. And then it gets broken down into a bunch of management roles, like being able to modify the base properties or something, or being able to modify an existing data stream. So maybe replacing metadata or replacing an image or replacing some other things or deleting parts of it. Those are all permissions that are broken up. Those base permissions exist for roles, and then that can get broken down further for individual objects themselves. Individual objects have the ability to have specific portions of them locked down to users or roles. Each object, if you have the Islandora Example module turned on, which is one of the core modules that should probably be turned on by default anyway. If you have Example turned on, you have the ability to create sets of whitelists for users that allow them different permissions. So you can say, well, normally everybody who can view objects should be able to view this thing, but in this specific case, I only want this user or this role to be allowed to view this thing. So you lock down permissions in that way. So they can get pretty granular. They can get down to the level of viewing an individual object, managing an individual object, or even viewing parts of an individual object. So you can say, I'm okay with this role being allowed to view objects in general, but I don't want them to be allowed to view the metadata for this object, or I don't want them to be allowed to view other parts of this object, like the display copy for a PDF or something like that. The last big set of permissions that are available is for doing things with Solar Search and search results. So you can have specific parts of metadata show up for specific roles on an object. You can say, okay, well, maybe only a certain role is allowed to view copyright information or the original owner or depositor of an object, whereas everybody else is allowed to view, the title and the description and things like that. As well as for search results, you can do the same sort of thing, and portions of the search as well. So certain users might be Certain users with higher permissions might be allowed to use specific facets when they're searching, or use specific advanced search terms when they're doing their searching, stuff like that. It gets pretty granular for search as well, but those are the major ones.
Question number 6, we are considering a migration from Content DM to Islandora. Can you talk about your experience in doing so and how that process would work?
Certainly. So we've done a bunch of these in the past, and we've actually, over time, developed a suite of tools for migrating Content DM content to Islandora, which we call Content DM migration tools, because we're really good at naming things. Our suite of Content DM migration tools uses the Content DM REST API. Essentially, our process for doing this is to grab information about Content DM collections and try to transform those collections and their contents into Islandora collections and their contents. The idea being you grab from the REST API a collection and all the information about it, and then you iterate through that, build a bunch of objects, and then transfer metadata over, and those have to have transforms applied to them as well, so they're in a more Islandora-friendly context. That's typically, like, we haven't really done anything with exporting from Content DM in the past. It's typically done through the REST API, which I believe is going to be the most, for huge bulk exports like that, it's probably the most convenient way of doing it. Although I believe in the past, we have also done raw exports of source XML from Content DM, and we do have kicking around a couple of transforms to move Content DM information into other formats. So that is another absolutely possible route that you could take, is to export the XML and sort of run it through an XSLT transform of some kind that gets into a format that's more convenient to put into Islandora. But the more appropriate bang for your buck solution would be something that properly utilizes the Content DM REST API and is actually able to pull information as it exists in the structure that it exists out of Content DM and programmatically generate objects inside Islandora. Or at least that's the way we do it. There's more manual methods available.
So just to add a little bit to that, this is something that we do all the time, migrate content into Islandora, not just from Content DM, but from a variety of other systems as well. So if you're considering a migration to Islandora, please reach out to me. Question number 7, does Islandora support linked data with the ability to find custom relationships between objects and records across collections?
So this is a tough one, because it's got, like, some of these terms are very, or they carry a lot of sort of emotional weight with them, whereas we're trying to provide solutions in here that support linked data, but also have functional and practical purposes. Absolutely, you can define any sort of custom relationships you want between objects, records across collections. And actually, we do that all the time. Anytime we have to define a new hierarchy inside Islandora, when we're defining new content types or new structures, we define our own custom relationships. The thing is that after that, we like, the way that those custom relationships are implemented is not in sort of the traditional way that you'd expect with an XSD kicking around somewhere that has a bunch of terms, or, like, you know, an OWL record that's like, this is what this relationship does, and this is what that relationship does. It's really just us defining new custom terms, and then having those custom terms be functional inside Islandora, or at least inside the custom modules that we create to provide custom content types. So again, like, you can absolutely do that if you want. It's just that currently the typical practice in Islandora is to make those things functional. Like when you create those relationships, they exist and they get indexed and they get put in the resource index and they're available. Like there's no special thing that you have to do in order to get those things into the resource index. They just go into the resource index and they're there and they're ready to query, and you can go right ahead and query them. But there's not a whole lot of support for the sort of, I'll say the semantic side of it, where you do the more complicated defining what the relationships are and having technical documentation that defines what the relationships are and that sort of stuff. It's very, very much more just straight functional than that is. With that being said, the way you do it essentially is to just, there are RDF XML files that are attached to each record inside Islandora, inside Fedora, as a matter of fact. And editing those is functionally equivalent to creating new relationships in Fedora. And so as soon as you edit one with new relationships, those relationships make their way into the RI, and then they're ready for querying. So it's just really as simple as that. It's just that the, again, more semantic side of it is a little more difficult to support.
Question number 8. My colleague who wants to digitize and ingest a collection of Lontar's manuscripts from Indonesia. Because the text is inscribed in palm leaf, these manuscripts are notoriously difficult to read. He told me it would be really helpful if you could change the brightness and contrast of the scans. We did see that the OpenSeaDragon viewer we were using is able to support a filter plugin. We were wondering whether it is possible to use this plugin in Islandora as well, and where we should start to make this possible.
So this is actually an interesting one, and this one might get a little bit more devy than the rest of the questions, just because the correct way to do this is with a little bit of custom development work. So the OpenSeaDragon plugin that we're referring to is a JavaScript file that you would have to load and contains a whole bunch of custom code that overloads things inside OpenSeaDragon itself. And the standard practice inside Drupal, at least inside Drupal 7, to make this happen is to modify the theme layer at the processing stage for the specific thing that you're looking to modify, load that JavaScript, and then make your own modifications to the actual viewer as it exists in sort of JavaScript land inside Drupal. So there's 2 steps to that. One is that there is a theme process function that's run on a JavaScript file, or that's run whenever you run the OpenSeaDragon viewer, that you can add your own little one to, that you can say, load this JavaScript file, or load that JavaScript file, load whatever JavaScript file you want. And then step 2 is you create your own little JavaScript that it loads that overrides the Islandora OpenSeaDragon viewer variable inside whatever JavaScript is doing. It's attached to the Drupal object in JavaScript land. It exists. It's set up by Islandora OpenSeaDragon, but once that's ready to go, you can get in there and mess around with it in whatever way you want, including the ways that are supported by this plugin, where you can load parts of the plugin and say, turn up the brightness or turn on the negative filter or do whatever else you want. So that's a sort of a long-winded way of saying that plugin I mean, you could throw it in the set of libraries with OpenSeaDragon, but it doesn't really do anything unless you activate the features of it inside JavaScript itself. But you absolutely could. Like, there's no reason that you couldn't do that. It's just that currently it would either take a little bit of custom development work, or it could be added to the main OpenSeaDragon module but that would also take a little bit of development work as well. I'm not entirely sure you can get everybody on board to support a plugin, as it is a plugin. It's not out-of-the-box functionality. So it'd probably be more appropriate to live in custom development work. Yeah, no, that's the kind of thing we do all the time here, is adding weird plugins with weird functionality that does weird things inside Islandora.
Yeah, so if that is something you'd like to have us look at doing, I will reach out to the person that sent this question in, and we can talk about how we can make this happen. So that's it for submitted questions. Now I'd like to open the floor to any questions that have arisen during the course of this webinar. And I believe you can just type them into the chat window. And as we're waiting for questions to come in, you can expect to see details on our June webinar released probably in the first 2 weeks of June. It doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. So with that, we'll close out for the day. Thank you all. Oh, 1 second. We do have a question come in. Oh. What encoder is used for large image files, TIFF or bitmaps?
TIFF, both of those simply go through ImageMagick. That's the base encoder. It's actually, it's not even provided by us. It's provided by Drupal. We simply use the Drupal ImageMagick encoder. We use ImageMagick to move things over to smaller JPEGs, JP2s, like those larger files when we import them. That's sort of step one of the process. And then step two of the process is once we have large image JP2s, those are imported into Islandora, or not imported into Islandora, but rather when you go to view them, they're viewed either through an image server like Jitoka. I guess they want to be called J2K, but they spell it Jitoka, so I'm calling it Jitoka. An image server like Jitoka, or there's been recent work to support image servers like IIIF servers, which like Cantaloupe, that are able to display those. So yeah, the initial processing is done through ImageMagick, and then can be done, and then the viewing is done through an image server like that. Kakadu is also supported. You essentially have to choose one or the other using, or no, it's not one or the other. It's that some of the stuff is done through ImageMagick, and then there's additional processing that can be done by Kakadu afterwards. It either speeds up things or adds more features. I forget precisely off the top of my head, but those are the two image conversion pieces of software that are used for large images.
Is there a way to make a slideshow display of a picture collection?
Yeah, actually, it's our slideshow. It's the owl carousel. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, there's a couple of ways to accomplish that. Even if, like the one we typically use is the owl carousel. It's a module that can be installed. Like, it's not our module, it's just a carousel module that is available with Drupal that you can use to place a block, on your front page or something like that, where you have a slideshow like that, where you can just move through a bunch of different images, and you can use that to, all of the images that are in Islandora in your repository are just there available for viewing. So you can provide them to something like Owl Carousel. You can say, here's a whole bunch of images from my repository that I want to create into a slideshow and put that on your front page or something like that. Yeah, we do that quite a bit. But yeah, we use the owl carousel. It's owl like the bird. Look that up under Drupal projects if you're looking for a carousel sort of slideshow like that.
Yes, there will be a recording sent out, so if you did miss your submitted question, you can listen to the answer later on today. Did you say data relationships are defined in Fedora or in the OS?
Data relationships are defined in Fedora. So they're defined in files that are attached to each individual objects. And then if you have the resource index turned on in Fedora, then those relationships also propagate back to the resource index afterwards. And when you're using Islandora, you have to have the resource index turned on, or else Islandora doesn't work. So, yeah.
All right, folks. Well, thank you for your questions. With that, we're going to end for the day. Again, if you have any questions at all following the call, please don't hesitate to reach out to me direct, and we can get you an answer. So with that, thank you, Dan, and thank you for everybody that joined today, and we'll talk to you next month.